Hi, welcome to Organizational Behavior, Developing Healthy Organizations. I'm Andrew Sears, and in this lesson, I'm going to be focusing on unique aspects of leading organizational change in Christian organizations using the competing values framework. Now, in many ways, this is a synthesis of the whole course. So if this was a movie, this would be kind of like the climax scene of the movie. So, what I'm trying to do, and just to explain, again, using Bloom's taxonomy, the idea is as you go through a course, you're going to be moving up to more advanced levels of learning. So, what I'm trying to do in this one is I'm trying to take a lot of the concepts in this course, competing values framework, and I'm going to evaluate it through a Christian lens, and then also create a synthesis of the material from this course into a Christian context. So one way of thinking about this is, the tools we provided in this course are just that, they're tools. And any tool you use, you need to use that if you're in a Christian organization in light of Scripture to guide organizational change. So many of you have used Myers-Briggs type indicator. There's Myers-Briggs is nowhere in the Bible. It's not, against the Bible, but it's a tool that you can use, right? And many Christian organizations have found this as a helpful tool. So in this organization, we've given you, Myers-Briggs is about assessing individuals. This course is much more about assessing organizations. So competing values framework and the organizational culture assessment instrument, in my opinion, is the closest you get to the organizational equivalent of a Myers-Briggs. And the same value of that and the same limitation applies. So, I've had some friends who they love the Myers-Briggs so much that they just define the entire world through the Myers-Briggs. That's a problem. Your primary lens should be Scripture. Everything needs to go through Scripture. We're first children of God, and we are not just our Myers-Briggs type, and our Myers-Briggs type is always an approximation of who we are. It doesn't define our identity. Same thing with this. So there's a lot of principles. So that's some of what I want to cover here. Now, another way of thinking about this is something called the Wesleyan quadrilateral. And this is often used as ways of knowing God, or if you're thinking about organizational change, you're assessing what's God's direction for your organization. So ultimately, you are going to use some combination of these four things, and different traditions will emphasize them in different ways. So Scripture, tradition, experience, and reason. And John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, used this, but a lot of theological schools, this is a grid that almost, all of them are going to teach at some point. And what's important in this is to recognize that different schools of thought might have different ways of framing those four things. So I actually really like this, everything has to be bound by Scripture. And then you have the others. Some people like to use the framework that Scripture is the foundation of the house. Other people like to just say they're all interlocking. You can't separate them. And then another point is just worth recognizing: different traditions will emphasize different aspects more. So evangelicals will emphasize Scripture more, Catholics tradition more, charismatics experience more, and liberal mainline denominations will emphasize reason more. So the point of this is to recognize that you need to apply your organization's values and filters to all of this. So one of the things to look at is to try to map the competing values framework to concepts that Christians are familiar with. So I want to start with one concept. So all of us are familiar with the difference between going, what people call the church gathered. So that's us all coming together on Sunday service, and then the church scattered, where we're all out, during the week. Many people have heard the phrase that we're supposed to be in the world, but not of it. I heard John Piper say that he liked the wording saying not of the world, but sent into the world. And I think that that's a good way of framing things. So whenever you're looking at competing values framework, you have the internal. That's going to be closer to the church gathered and not of the world. And the external, that's the church scattered, and that's the sent into the world. And then you have the other dimensions of this. So the stable versus flexible. So the stable is going to be, organizations trying to be faithful to scripture, and flexible is trying to be culturally relevant. So each of these dimensions, if in each of the quadrants, you can have risk if you get off balance. So, and many of you are familiar with these. So if you have, too much emphasis in this quadrant, then you have this insular church, or people call it the holy huddle, where the only people you know are other Christians. There can be a challenge if you use too much Christianese, and you're too just ministry, and don't have any value for business. You can be inaccessible to those with business culture. If you're a nonprofit, often that can be a big problem because especially cross-culturally, you'll have groups that say, we have to be really close to those, the culture of those that we're serving. And that's a good principle. But if you lose funding and you have burnout from lack of resources, then you're not caring for the community that you're trying to serve. So you need to be a bridge. You need to be able to bridge that gap, and you need to have a culture that can balance those two things, and not just be a culture that's really close to the clients but can't connect with the business community. Another challenge you can have is being over-programmed. I was a part of a church once whenever I just started coming back to God, and it must have seemed like I was in church like 7 days a week. I don't think it was quite 7, but it might have been close to 5. Here the example is just a church that only serves its members. So it's, by its members, for its members, doesn't do anything to serve the community or evangelize. And that, everyone, I think, would agree, is problematic. Now, at the opposite extreme is an organization that's extremely driven. So, this drivenness might create burnouts or church splits. I've seen both churches that have had splits, and I've seen movements that become, too driven, even, movements of Christians that serve the poor that create splits. And you can have this secularization that happens from, the idea that everyone needs to be super professional. So we're not as concerned, often you say you want to have competence and character, and you become only concerned about competence, and character becomes second. You get people with lots of degrees and lots of competence, but ultimately you become secularized through that. And then you have the culture. Everyone's seen the movie, where the person says, it's not personal, it's just business. And then the person always replies back, well, it's personal for me, right? And you have to balance these two things. You can't just say it's just business. And then the other challenge is if you're too focused on this business culture, then you're going to be inaccessible to relational cultures. You might have a really rich organization that has tons of money, but is culturally distanced from its clients. So an example of that, I would say, is a really large Christian social service organization where it's essentially a business. It's, could barely be distinguished from a government agency that's serving the same functions. And the people are just in it for a job. They're just trying to make money. And, it's really lost its heart. Now, in this quadrant, in the operations or control quadrant, the risk there is you can descend into legalism or judgmentalism, or isolated fundamentalism, and you could have a slow death from cultural irrelevance and decline, where you just become inaccessible to especially flexible cultures. So an example of this might be isolationist, fundamentalist church there, where, they think maybe 0.01% of people are going to heaven. And, basically that's just people in their church, and maybe only half the people in their church or 10% of the people in their church are going to heaven. That's not a healthy mentality, right? So, and then the last risk is if you become too focused on this entrepreneurial mindset, then here the risk of fraud or financial mismanagement or sexual abuse or misconduct isn't because, entrepreneurs are going to do all these things. It's because entrepreneurs don't like rules. They don't like to have all these guidelines. And these are the safety rails that keep you from these things. So you need to have your financial policies to keep you safe. You need to have policies to protect clients that you serve, and even as a leader, you need to have good boundaries so that you're not going to be exposed to risk or temptation, and all those risks can result in more lawsuits, government investigations. There's also a risk of being secularized because everything new seems like a great idea, and you start to do too many new things. And an example of that is the criticism, whatever you think of the emerging church. There are emerging churches out there that have gone way too far because everything they think is new, and they basically come up with new theology and doing weird things like adding a member to the Trinity and things like that, and that's a problem. So the idea is we want to create balance in our organization, and what happens is if you have people in any one of these mindsets, and if your organization, your culture becomes too dominant with people in any one of these mindsets, then you're going to be at risk of imbalance. And the idea is you want to try to create balance that reflects your whole organization. So if what you're trying to do is have this balance of if you're going to have this balance across all four quadrants, then what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to do some change within your organization. So that's what the next part is about, is how do you bring change? So you want to hire people who are strong in domains that you need to grow in. So ultimately, if you want to grow in the ministry quadrant, then what you want to do is you want to hire more graduates from Bible schools and seminaries. You want to get people with ministry degrees, people with Bible degrees, people with cultural or missions degrees, people with human resources degrees, or people who've previously worked at churches or ministries. Now, if all your staff are in that quadrant, then you may be imbalanced if they all came from that quadrant. And if you're trying to be more business minded, then you're going to get more business majors or nonprofit management majors. And you'll often get, there's a lot of really strong Christians that attended secular schools. In fact, most Christians typically have attended secular schools. Get people who have sales backgrounds to do things like fundraising. And then on the operations side, you're going to look for people who have accounting majors, business majors with detailed personality, or just anyone who has a detailed personality. And often that's people who've done previous work in project management, accounting, operations, or logistics. And then entrepreneurial, you're looking for entrepreneurship majors, entrepreneurs, or small business owners. So you have to assess which of these quadrants that you're trying to shift your organization in. So the biggest lever you can have is, in my opinion, is in hiring new staff. Now, what you can do is you can assess your staffing. How many of your staff would you say are their dominant quadrant is in the ministry or relational, and at what levels of leadership? How many are in the business or funding, and at what levels of leadership? How many are in the operations governance, and at what levels of leadership? And how many are innovative, and at what levels of leadership? And if what you're trying to do is you're trying to shift to have more business people, or say shift to have more ministry people, you need to try to get more people in that quadrant and more at higher levels of leadership. Now, the other thing you can do is promote staff training. And ultimately, what you want to do is to provide staff training in the direction you want your organization to move towards. But you also, as a leader, you need to do training that will help you lead the organization in the direction that needs to go, or in whatever department that you have. So the past about 3 years ago, I spent almost all my time focused on operations. Now I'm doing a lot on, I want to grow a lot in the business mindset, but I'm also doing a lot actually in the ministry mindset, because I'm trying to grow there. So, what are the types of training? Cross-cultural management ministry, urban youth ministry, and I don't list all our Bible courses because we have a ton under here. But a lot of these are going to help. And then the business courses and the fundraising courses. And then you have the operations and governance courses. And then you have the innovation courses. So ultimately what you want to do is you want to try to figure out, okay, we need to have much more people. We need to professionalize. We need to have more people take business courses. I'm going to fund some people to take an MBA degree or things along those lines. And you can kind of use the workplace behavioral profile as a guide for training, and you can have your staff take this. Now, it's worth saying this is designed for a business context, so it's not entirely focused on nonprofits, and you might look at it a little bit different from nonprofits. So with that, I want to start talking about some common problems with Christian nonprofits, ministries, and churches. So one of the most common problems I see is that in nonprofits is you'll have two groups. It's almost like this cross-cultural divide. You have the ministry mindset staff and you have business mindset staff, and they can't communicate well, and then they judge each other, and the non-dominant group leaves. So say your organization's super ministry minded and you're like, you know what, we need to hire a bunch of business people. Well, if you don't know how to address this and you're not changing the whole organization, you're going to hire a bunch of business people and they're going to quit. Or vice versa, because you need to be able to bridge the gap, because there's too much cultural distance, there's a lack of common language, and one of the main purposes, and part of this is explain, why does City Vision exist? So why we exist, in a big part, is we're trying to develop bilingual fluency between business and ministry culture. So we can talk to the business world using their language, and we can then explain the ministry concepts using their language and vice versa, and that's going to help build trust among both groups. So that's something you might think about, because I think that the hiring strategy and the training strategy go together, because if you have a bunch of ministry people who are in leadership and they don't learn to talk with business people or vice versa, then you're going to run into problems, and ultimately you're going to lose a lot of your senior leaders. So the other huge challenge is this challenge of being organizationally innovative but biblically conservative. And let me first define what I mean by biblically conservative. A lot of people in the U.S. think that being biblically conservative means that you're politically conservative. So, many people have heard the phrase, God's not a Republican or a Democrat. And biblically conservative, what I would say is that's consistent with white evangelicals, most of the Black Protestant church, most of Latino Protestant. So it's people who basically, believe that the Bible's, unerring, and they follow what's in it, is kind of the key part of that. And one of the things that I've found is a lot of organizations that are biblically conservative, they're also risk averse. And I think that that's a challenge, because the world is changing, and you can be faithful to Scripture, but also very culturally relevant. So I want to talk about what happens whenever you have organizations that become too dominated by either quadrant, on the entrepreneurial mindset and the operations mindset, especially across Christian circles. So, and what are the risks? So, what are the risks if you're very entrepreneurial? So, my dominant quadrant is entrepreneurial. So, I'm first going to pick on that quadrant because it's more fair to pick on yourself first. I'm an INXP, so I'm not an extrovert. But the most common personality type for the entrepreneur is the ENFP or ENTP sometimes. But the idea of the ENFP in this quadrant and is the idea that, all ideas are good ideas, and that can be great while brainstorming. That should actually be one of the rules of brainstorming. But not all ideas are good ideas. So you might throw them out there, but some of them are going to be bad ideas, right? And what happens is if you get a culture that has too many people who are these ENFPs, have the idea that all ideas are good ideas, then you start to create something that I would call innovative theology. And I'm not talking about, applied theology. I'm talking about core theology. So, the words innovative and theology, in my opinion, should never go together in the same way that the words innovation and accounting shouldn't go together. Innovative accounting really is only going to work if you work for the mob, right? And they want to find innovative ways to violate the law. And I think it's kind of the same way with innovative theology. You're not trying to say we're going to add or take away a person from the Trinity. And if you have a ministry of all entrepreneurial, mindset people or all ENFPs, then that can drive syncretism. And then you can have the same type of problem if you have all ISTJs. So you have this imbalanced tendency that all risk is bad. And you get this broken mindset of God is the great accountant, or God is the accountant. In 1 Corinthians 13:5, it says, keep no record of wrongs. Whenever I grew up, I was in the church that I'm pretty sure they missed their calling because they had a record of every member's wrong for their entire lifetime. And it was a church, now that whenever I look back on it, it was a church where just about everyone in the church was an ISTJ. And that's not to say that all ISTJs are going to be, legalistic, just like all, entrepreneurs aren't syncretistic, right? But the idea is if you get a culture that's the only thing that's acceptable, then it can start to drive towards legalism. So what you really want is you want to be able to, work with your team. And if you have someone who's entrepreneurial, one solution to avoid this imbalance is you provide strong training in the Bible and other quadrants. The second solution is to recruit biblically conservative entrepreneurs who value other quadrants. So there are a lot of biblically conservative organizations that are incredibly innovative. World Vision is incredibly innovative, and they are an evangelical organization. Cru, which used to be called Campus Crusade, if you look at their use of technology, it's just off the scale in terms of how they use technology. It's just amazing. Other groups like Saddleback and with Rick Warren and Willow Creek, very innovative organizations. And this is how they do it. They get people who are innovative and they hire them, and they make sure that they're trained effectively in the Bible. And that's really what City Vision's about. So my background, I went to MIT. I co-founded a research group with one of the fathers of the internet. I was a part of the dot-com boom. I was about as entrepreneurial as you get. But City Vision at our core is biblically conservative. We're not, we believe that the Bible's inerrant. That's at our core. Not all our students are coming from that perspective, but that is the perspective that we're coming from. And so, if you have, a lot of operations staff, what do? You want to train them in the other quadrants, and you want to hire grace-filled operations staff who value other quadrants. So another reason why City Vision exists is because we want to help you with this. We want you to have a lot of really strong operations staff who are grace-filled. We want you to have entrepreneurs that are Bible-based, and we want to help promote communication between those. So that's a big part of why we exist. So some other key principles for organizational change for Christians. So Andy Crouch, who was editor of Christianity Today, wrote a book called Culture Makers, and he created a distinction between making culture is a lot harder than being a cultural critic. He said that it's a lot more difficult to create healthy culture than it is to criticize it. So, many of you are in families or maybe parents. It's a lot more difficult to create a healthy family than it is to just point out flaws in a family. And what happens is organizational change and organizational health as topics can easily gather people who just want to complain and gossip, or people who've been hurt. It's kind of like counseling. So a lot of people who go into counseling and psychology are people who've experienced intense pain. And that's fine. That's actually why I started in it. But ultimately, we need to transform that. So we need God to heal our own pain and to forgive deeply to be able to lead effectively in organizational health. If your whole approach to organizational health is based in reaction to the way that you got wounded, and you're like, I got wounded by this organization because it was too entrepreneurial, well, you're probably going to create the opposite quadrant organization. And it's going to have the flip side of the coin in terms of those. And ultimately, there's many phrases that people use. Those who do not transform their pain transmit it. And there's the phrase that hurt people go ahead and hurt people, hurt people, hurt people. So ultimately, if you're going to lead in this space, then you need to have deep transformation. You need to not be living in reaction to these things. You need to understand who God's made you to be and play that role, but not be saying, well, this happened to me whenever I was growing up or at this church, and therefore I'm never going to be anything like that. Because it's going to distort things. Another principle is just respecting those in authority, Romans 13 and many other places in the Bible. Recognize that typically those in senior management see many different competing priorities that those below them don't see. So often I'll work with my staff and they'll understand their department or they'll understand their quadrant, but they don't understand what are the trade-offs. It's hard for them to understand why do we need to move in this direction right now? And ultimately what you need to have trust with your leadership. If you need it, just respect that their role is to see all the quadrants. And don't try to initiate change beyond your own authority in the organization. So if you're trying to get your organization to do change using competing values framework, then the way to do that, if you're not the head of the organization, is to explain this to the head of your organization and then to have the head of your organization lead that change. Or if you have a department, you can lead change within your department, whatever domain that you have authority over. But if you're in a 100-person organization and you're at the kind of very bottom of the organization, you're probably not going to reform the whole organization. But what you can do is you can try to get those above you to buy into some of these ideas and then use these tools. Then another principle is just to recognize that organizations are living organisms. So one of my favorite examples of this, and we use a book by this title called The Cat and the Toaster. So, and the whole point of that book is that we live as Christian in living organisms, and a toaster, you can take apart all its pieces and then put it back together and the toaster works. But if you took apart all the pieces of cat, it's not going to work anymore. And organizational change is a lot like that. Many people will try to do what's so-called right in the organizational change, and they'll kill the cat. It has to balance the cost of the change on the organization and on individuals, and have that relational value. And then the other thing is just all scriptural principles apply when considering organizational health, change in health. So, and one way of showing that is just taking, this is one of the maps that's used for organizational behavior overall. And you look at the environment, you look at how individuals operate, how groups and teams operates, you look at organizational characteristics, you look at leadership, and then you look at how a manager can influence all those things. So all of those need to go through the light of Scripture to guide organizational change in ministries. And ultimately, that's the key point in this, is that as a Christian and leader in your organization, you need to think about that. Now, some of our students aren't going to be in Christian organizations. Someday you will be, or you may just think about this in terms of your church. If you're in a secular organization, there's a lot of these ideas that you can use and some of the principles that you can use, but some of them, you have to recognize that may not be what is applied in your organization. So it's been great having you in this course, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this week in the course. If you have any questions, please ask your faculty member. Thanks a lot.